Hello everyone, it's another Thursday, another Overflow API review. Today we do 2 hours again, and we have at least 4 items on the agenda, but if you look at the backlog, it is bleeding red right now because of a lot of stuff that's going on. So depending on how fast we are with these 4, we will very likely cover more items afterwards. So we started with this one here because this one seems, from the ones we have marked red, as one of the biggest. So Shai, take it away.
Yeah, hi guys. Thanks for taking this with short notice. So this is basically an addition to system data to ADO.NET. I'm calling this DB data source. It's a new abstraction alongside DB command, DB connection, and so on. The idea is you can look at the the code sample just to get the feel of it. So today, if you want to create a new connection to connect to the database, you basically new up a connection, or you use the driver's DB provider factory, factory to new up a connection, and then you open it and then you execute something against it. Now, what's generally missing in the world of system data is a notion of a factory for connections that are already usable. So basically, if I have, for example, DI, I'll take it from the simplest place. If I have DI, then I need to, every single time in every ASP.NET application, I need to manage the getting the connection string at every place where I need to actually new up a connection and pass that around. If I also have various other things that I need in addition to the connection string, for example, if I'm using SSL, then I might have some sort of callback to validate certificates coming from the server. Then again, I need that at each and every site where I'm going to new up a connection and then open it. So what typically happens in most applications using ADO.NET is everybody has some sort of factory, which they register as a singleton in DI, which encapsulates all that kind of data that you need in order to establish a connection to a database. So the first thing that this thing does is basically act as that factory instead of everybody having to re-implement it over and over again. It's a factory for connections which can be used immediately. So it is unlike the DB provider factory. I don't know how much people are familiar with that already exists in system data, which is purely a factory for instances of connections. It doesn't also encapsulate the connection data like the connection string and all that. It just creates a blank connection, which you then again have to feed with the connection, SSL callbacks, and so on and so forth. Gotcha. Should I pause already for questions? I do have some other stuff to say, obviously.
That to me was the key difference. So basically, because you talk quite fast, so I think
Sorry about that.
So to me, that was the key question I had. It was like, how does DB data source differ from DB connection? It's not about open versus closed. It's really about the connection string itself, so that people don't have to spread that around, right? You don't want within the app everybody to do that. I mean, I guess you could solve that in DI by just coming up with your own connection string thingy, right? And then that would work. But so
yes, is
that the key difference, or is there anything else?
That's the key difference between DB provider factory and this new thing. But this new thing also answers other other requirements or other things that we want to add. By the way, there's a section comparing the DB provider factory just below. If you want to scroll down and read a little bit more, then that's in that. I did that comparison right there. Exactly. Exactly. So it's basically that DB provider factory generates blank instances. It's just about creating the correct instance for your ADO.NET provider. Whereas what we're looking for in this PR is to have an actual thing which hands out connections which you can use. Which is not what DB provider factory does. That's basically the difference here. So there was a question of retrofitting DB provider factory with this capability, but that would be very confusing because some connections it hands out are ready to be used and others are not ready to be used. So I really would prefer us to keep those two abstractions separate because they cater to different needs, basically. Up to now, all good?
Yeah, so I was just looking at the API shape. So, and I've reshuffled it a little bit here for myself. So it seems like, when we look at this, we have a public service and then the protected one. So you have like get connection, open connection, create command, and then you have corresponding DB versions of them that are the protected ones. How do they differ?
So this is a standard ADO.NET pattern, which nobody likes very much. It's basically a form of covariance. The way ADO.NET APIs always work is you have a protected virtual method with the DB prefix, and then you have a public non-virtual one which calls that one. And the idea is that a provider implementation of this, a subclass of this thing, is expected to both override the protected virtual one and also do a new for the public one, so that that method can return its own typed version. I hope I'm making sense. It's basically just implementing covariance, but in the old way.
I see. So yeah, because you need to override and you need to define one, so that wouldn't work. So I guess on the base type, the public ones are really only used if you're statically typed against DB data source. If you're typed, let's say, SQL data source, then you would have a get
Correct.
connection that returns a SQL connection and a SQL command rather than the DB connection. DB
Precisely.
Command. Yeah, gotcha.
Precisely. So there might be people using DB data source directly if they're in a database agnostic application, which is designed to run against multiple providers. So they would use the abstraction. That is a bit less useful for this specific abstraction, but it is possible. But usually what you will do is you will be working against a SQL DB data source, or SQL data source rather. And then if you call, get connection, you get back a SQL connection, which has, the specific SQL APIs.
Gotcha. So then the other question I have is, so let's say we ship this now, right? It's part of .NET 7 now. What is the expectation for things like, Microsoft data.SQL client, for example? Are they going to, how are they going to support this, basically?
So that's always the important question. Last year we introduced DB batch, which was an abstraction, that abstraction basically you have to implement or it doesn't work. Whereas with this specific abstraction, it was really important for me for this to have a shim to work out of the box without requiring any sort of provider support. So if you look up a little bit, or was it down? Sorry. So what I'm proposing is to also, it was down. So you see the DB provider factory edition I'm proposing here, which is create right above the snippet, right above it, this one exactly. So DB provider factory is the thing that every provider has, which we just discussed, right? So you can use it to create a command, a connection, and you can also use it to create a data source. And this thing, the idea here is that this thing returns a shim, or returns basically a default implementation, which you can see the beginning of below, which basically just makes this work. Okay, so the idea is that providers don't need to actually implement this unless they need to, unless they want to introduce extra functionality. I saw something with secure string here. I'm suspicious.
The running joke, you see.
Yes.
So that, I guess that would make sense. And then the idea is that let's say you're building now an ASP.NET 7 app, right? Would we register effectively this thing by default? And then users would be able to say, I want my own SQL specific source and I do something separate?
So I wasn't thinking to propose any sort of implicit or automatic registration. If a user wants a SQL DB, like a SQL data source, then they register it as a singleton in their ASP.NET application. There could be a nice API, like a little bit of DI sugar to do that. But basically, that's if you scroll all the way up to the top, then you see the examples of how that would look like. A little bit below. This is before the DI stuff. Yeah, here's like the DI kind of things. So this one is how you would do the one you just highlighted is how you would do it today. So you can register a scoped connection in this way. I see. But that is insufficient if you need multiple connections, for example, in your controller or whatever. And the thing that you now highlighted would be the proposed new thing, assuming that you're linked against NPG SQL and you have no problem creating directly an NPG SQL data source with NPG SQL APIs.
Gotcha. So basically that's why it's virtual. So that means SQL can override it. So that they could decide in their NuGet package to have a build specific for .NET 7, in which case they would define their own SQL data source thingy. But if they don't, and you go via the DB factory stuff, because it's virtual, it would do something reasonable.
Exactly. That is exactly the idea here.
So then let me ask you this, what is the problem with the bad phrasing on mine probably, but like the generic one that you have in quotes, like what's wrong with that? Like why can't this be the data source for everybody?
Okay, so this relates to like the next points I had to speak to. So the very generic idea of a DB data source, because it's not specific to any provider, all it knows about is a connection string, because that's the only thing that's universal across ADO.NET providers. But actual specific providers will usually have various other things. For example, for authentication, some will have an auth token that needs to rotate. Some will have SSL validation callbacks, and various other things that you need in order to actually connect. And this is where NPG SQL and SQL Client would provide their own subclass of DB data source with those properties, okay, allowing you to specify all that stuff. That's the first answer to what you're saying. Does that make sense already?
It does, and presumably, like in many cases, you can work this around, but because they also accept those configuration options as their connection string properly, right?
So it really depends. The auth token, so for example, SSL callbacks, and this really connects to my next point. SSL callbacks you can't put in the connection string because it's .NET code.
Right.
And that's a fundamental problem of the ADO.NET model. So you have the connection string, and there's a tendency to shove whatever you can into this string. It's good because it's not an API, it's connection, so it's not like a new API that you have to think about whether it's now universal or not. It's just a string, but then it only works as long as it's a bool or an int or a string or something like that, right? Once you're going into any sort of configuration that's an API, then the connection string doesn't work anymore, which is one of the motivations exactly behind this thing. I do have another pretty persuasive case, by the way, for this. So one of the things I wanted to do is to make NPG SQL, so an ADO.NET provider, use iLogger, so use basically Microsoft extensions logging, right? So in order for that to work, you need to somehow provide an iLogger factory into that thing. And there's no point at the moment inside ADO.NET where you would inject that thing, where you would provide it. So you can provide an iLogger factory every time you create an NPG SQL connection. That hands out the connections where you can do all that configuration stuff, seal it, say, okay, I'm done. And now you can start getting connections out of it and use them based on that configuration.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I think that answers all the questions that I had. So yeah, you're not proposing, I guess you haven't talked really with anybody on the provider side whether they want to provide one and they already have properties in mind that they want to use or expose.
So I did. If you look below, this thread has a conversation with various provider writers as well. So the MySQL one has their thing. The SQL client people, I haven't. So there's Ray2, who's a contributor there, who's kind of commented on it. I haven't been in touch with the specific people there, but I know that they do have those things. Whether they actually go and implement this thing to expose them is, it might take a little bit of time, and until that happens, people can't use DB data source with those things.
Yeah. I mean, the primary reason why I'm asking is less about whether, I can review the APIs right now. I'm okay with doing that later. It's just more the proofing of the concept, right? I mean, everything you said makes sense. It's just usually when we introduce abstractions, it's always nice to say, oh, here's already a consumer that shows that this works. And ideally, it's not just one. Ideally, it would be, as you said, MPGL would be one, Postgres is another, and then SQL, and they're all like, yep, that seems to do what I want to do. And I'm happy with that. But everything you said makes sense to me. I think it from the way ADO.NET works today, it seems like a fairly sensible and arguably missing concept that we should have. So I don't have any concerns, I guess. Anybody else on the call? Any concerns? I see one person shaking, thumbs up. Jeremy is still thinking.
Dispose async shouldn't be virtual. Neither should dispose.
Oh, you should just call into dispose, right?
Well, dispose should do the dispose pattern of having a protected virtual dispose bool disposing, and then dispose async as a pattern. So
is that the case even when this base class has absolutely no native things to take care of?
Especially that.
I was,
because that's the whole point, right? That a derived class can add a finalizer without replacing the other things in the middle.
Okay, I'll read up on it. I won't take your time on this. No problem.
Yeah. If you follow the finalizer pattern, then don't put a finalizer in the base class, but put a dispose bool method in the base class and make that protected, not public.
Okay.
Yeah, so just adjusting the dispose and dispose async to match the patterns, and then
Sure thing.
that's all I have.
I do have one thing where I actually wanted to consult with you guys a little bit as well. There's another aspect to this, but if there's any other questions about this.
I mean, are we talking about detailed API stuff right now?
Yeah.
I don't understand create DB command, or well, maybe the first question is
That's the thing.
Get DB connection. Does that always return a new one?
So that's an a DB connection in ADO.NET is a facade, right? It's not it doesn't represent a physical connection. You can call open and close on it, and it could have a pool thing behind it. So yeah, basically this thing will every time return a new instance of DB connection. Typically, yes.
And that thing's disposable.
Yes.
So how would create DB command? How would I dispose of the connection?
So create DB command is this additional aspect I wanted to talk about, which goes beyond the idea of just handing out connections. So that's a good question what you're asking. So maybe I'll just go ahead and talk to that. So there's one more thing I wanted to introduce here, and that is the following. So let's say you now have a DB data source registered in DI or whatever, and you have access to it wherever you need to do database stuff. It turns out that in many cases, when you're doing a database query, you don't actually need to concern yourself with a connection as an API detail. You just want to send a query to the database, right? You want to do a select or you want to do an update. When you do the case where you do want to use a connection is when you have something stateful. Typically, when you want to do a transaction, a database transaction around that encompasses multiple commands, then you need a transaction, and therefore you also need a connection. But as long as you don't need a transaction, it's kind of weird and not nice to force users to have to deal with that concept all the time in their code. So they create a connection, and then they create a command from it, and then they execute the command. And that step of the connection, we're kind of like, why do we force users to do this? So what I want this DB data source abstraction to also do is allow users to execute a command directly against them. So to jump above the step of having to deal with a DB connection. Now, this has another aspect. One of the big perf features of NPG SQL, the Postgres driver, which I maintain, is also a command execution model that isn't actually linked to connection. So instead of getting a connection, I'm doing this as simply and quickly as I can. Instead of getting a connection, creating a command and executing it against the connection, you basically tell the driver, execute these things for me, and it will schedule them and possibly coalesce them into the same physical connection behind the scenes, but the user isn't concerned with all that stuff. Basically, the idea is to extract the DB connection, get it out of this process for places where there's no state or transaction. And this is what that create DB command, now getting to the code, that's the idea behind this create DB command here. You're getting a command that is ready for use directly against that DB data source. And in what you see here, you basically will get a wrapper that internally does have a DB connection. It opens it before executing the command, executes the command, and then closes it. I hope that makes it a little bit clear. So you're getting a connection that maybe behind the scenes is going to be a command that behind the scene is going to be using a connection, but you as a user are not concerned with that connection at all. That was the additional aspect which I wanted to talk about here.
So
disposing the DB command that comes back from create DB command will dispose that connection?
Yes.
Both the command and the connection.
That's right.
So I guess the idea is that this instance of DB command knows whether it owns the connection or not, right? It's an implementation of that thing, but because the user never got one, it would be very good for the user to say command.connection.dispose, right? That
correct.
Would be
exactly. In fact, that the connection property and command in that case has to throw. And that's what that default implementation of so create DB command in what I'm proposing will return a default implementation that wraps the actual provider command. And in that implementation, if you call connection, you get an exception because there is no connection as far as you're concerned. There's just a command.
Ouch. Yeah, that. And so is this a function of whether you pass in null for the command text or not? Is that the idea?
Not really. So you can still change the command text, and ADO.NET coalesces null to empty string in that particular instance. The problem isn't with the command; it's with the command text, the SQL. It's with the connection that you're going to be using to execute it.
I see. You're saying any command that is created using create command doesn't own its connection logically. Like it's like, or should say like it does own the connection, so the user doesn't get to see the connection.
Correct.
Basically.
Correct. That is the concept here, exactly.
So that way you can't put more commands on that same connection.
Yes.
It's explicitly this one command is the only thing that's ever going to run on this connection.
So again, what usually is going to happen here, you get a command. It doesn't even have a physical connection at that point. When you call execute on it, you set it up, you put SQL on it, you put parameters, you call execute. At that point, that command is going to go get a connection from the DB data source from which it originated, and execute itself against that connection, and afterwards it's going to close it. So it's not like it owns an actual physical connection for its entire lifetime.
Oh, so the code that's actually in there, we should just ignore that code.
Yeah, I removed all the code from my own screen here, so I don't get confused by what it does.
Okay.
I mean, I think this makes sense. The only thing is, to me, that seems kind of orthogonal to the DB data source concept itself, but I mean, I can see it being useful. I think I would have to think more about what that would mean, right? Because I guess another aspect to this is the command you're getting back, you don't get to put the stuff in a transaction either, right? So like there's no transaction. If you, I guess if you ask or set one, or I guess asking one would be twice, you get null. If you set one, you will throw presumably, and then same with connection. So that I don't think it's necessarily bad. It's just always somewhat unfortunate when you have types where properties have to throw, especially on the getter, right? Because you effectively have something that is kind of, a hot potato in a certain way, right? Basically, don't look too closely, right? Then bad things might happen. At the same time, it also feels equally weird to introduce this new command concept on top of it, because now you have to reduplicate everything a command can do, right? Parameters, all of that stuff, right? So especially given that this is already a polymorphic hierarchy, that seems would be very heavy-handed too. But yeah, I don't have a good handle on like how surprising people will find that. But I also don't know what the alternative would be.
So the idea is, if you want to manipulate connection or transaction, then just don't use this specific create DB command, right? Just get a connection from the DB data source instead and create a command over that, and then you're back to the normal world. This is a very specific API where, yes, you get a restricted form of a DB command. That is true, so that we can perform the various optimizations behind the scenes, and also so that you can skip that step of dealing with the connection. Basically,
I think that is fine. I think the one advice I would have is try to find a term for this concept, and don't just call the method create command. Call it whatever you want to call this, like, I don't know, create lightweight command or something to that extent, right? So that you can tell people like, this is not just giving you a command out of convenience. This is a command that is special, and so there's certain things you don't get to do with it, right? Because I see. Yeah. It makes sense to say, if you want to control the transaction and the connection, don't use this method.
This is not for you.
Open the DB connection by the other method, and then you new up the SQL command like you always did, right? Or go to the provider and basically create a command. The other option that you might want to do is just provide two methods here, like basically one that gives you a regular connection and one that gives you the lightweight one, so that people don't have to go back to the connection to figure out how to do that, right? So it goes back to the provider factory, right? Because there's no connection here from if you have a DB data source, how do I create a regular command if I don't know the actual provider type, right?
So you get the connection, and on the connection you have a factory method to get a command.
I see.
So
okay.
That would be the more standard way of doing things today.
So I would call open connection. Mm-hmm. What's the difference between open connection and get connection? So
get connection returns an unopened connection, whereas open just does get an open, and it mirrors the current ADO.NET API where you construct when you construct say a SQL connection, it is not open, and then you have to call open, which does the IO.
And get-DB connection always creates a new one, or no?
It creates a new one, yeah.
Then maybe call it create, maybe? Or is that the general pattern that is elsewhere?
Good question. Maybe create is more. The thing is, okay, so the thing is that that's maybe another aspect, but this thing is going to correspond in most cases to a connection pool inside the driver, in case people, are unaware. So you're getting a connection here in the sense that the object you're getting, the DB connection instance, is new each time, but within the driver, it is linked to an existing physical connection. That's just how pooling works in ADO.NET, because DB connection is a facade, and in pooling scenarios, it's linked to a physical connection internally. That's why create is a little bit of a problematic term here. You're creating the facade.
I think it's more about, what you want to convey, right? Because if I don't have any context here, I just look at this API, like I would get the impression there's one connection behind each data source, but I can open additional ones. Because get connection gives me the one singleton, and then open gives me a new one.
I see.
So I think, yeah, I don't know enough about the underlying thing, but it depends on what mental model you want people to walk away with, right?
Definitely one where this thing can hand out more than one.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay, that's a good point.
And as you said earlier, right? If DB connection already doesn't really correspond to a physical one, maybe it doesn't matter how the pool thinks about it, because you're already logically abstracting the pool anyway, right? But yeah, I think the pattern you describe makes sense.
Okay, I guess I don't have any more questions. There is so I hope I don't shoot myself in the foot too much here, but there is a small naming issue here. The name data source already exists in the API. Unfortunately, there is already something called a DB data source enumerator in ADO.NET. It's a very old type that's basically used to give you a list of known databases around you and the application. It returns, it's an enumerator over a data table. Again, we're very old school with various data. It's not ideal to introduce this with a name where the enumerator, which is the old type, obviously doesn't enumerate over this thing, right? I don't really have a much better name. It's also very old, the other one, and very, very seldom used. So I'm hoping this is not too big of a problem. It's obviously a naming smell. The question is how bad it is. So I just went ahead and shot myself in the foot.
I was typing notes. I didn't even hear it. Which API are you talking about?
Okay, so maybe we can move on. Yeah, there's the DB data source enumerator type that's very old and very rarely used, but unfortunately took the name data source. And so this could have been called DB connection source, but it's also about executing directly and not just about handing out connections. It could be called DB database, but that's absolutely awful. So I'm hoping this naming is tolerable, even though there's that other type that is, similarly named but with a different meaning. Or I'm open if people have any ideas, by the way.
Is it a type people actually use, or is it just exposed off like some sort of enumerate and it only ever appears in a for each?
I can't commit to it. I've really almost never seen that enumerator type in use. It's very, very rare, and I'm not even. Most providers don't have an implementation for it. It's an abstraction as well. I can't give a 100% answer here, of course.
And what does this What are these data sources?
The other one?
Yeah.
Basically, it's another word for database in that context. It's basically giving you a list of databases configured on my system or globally.
Oh, I see. So it's basically logically the equivalent when you go to Management Studio, you connect to a server and it shows you the databases that are there.
And
so master.
And it's even called,
yeah,
and it's called data source there as well, by the way. It's another word for a synonym for database many times. Whereas here it's not quite that.
Yeah, it isn't, but it is, right? I mean, like logically, I mean, when you construct a connection, like the data source is the thing you're connecting to, right? So that's the closest I can think of.
That's also how I see it. That's why I think it's okay, but I did want to be full disclosure here.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. Because I think you also want a name that, you know, kind of is short and makes sense. And I mean, if you go full-blown Java swing, why didn't you call it like DB data source, sorry, DB connection wrapper provider manager factory? Then it's probably worse.
I'm happy you mentioned that, because the term data source in this meaning actually comes from Java. In the Java world, that's exactly a connection pool is a data source. That's exactly the way, and it hands out connections. So this actually is completely aligned with Java, in case we care about that thing, but in a good way.
Yeah, normally the Java names are very long and involve manager and provider and factory all in one sentence. But yeah, I mean, that makes sense.
I'm painfully aware.
Yeah, I think it's
honestly,
close enough.
Yeah, I like the fact that this name is succinct, honestly.
Yeah. I mean, again, if you actually use ADO.NET and I see the type name and I see the methods on them, I think I would know what it does.
That's pretty good for an ADO.NET thing.
I mean, there are not that many concepts, but yeah.
Yeah.
You ever looked at all the DB?
Not a great API.
Yeah. All right, so let me just copy paste what I have so far, and then we can tell me whether I missed anything. I guess I missed a quote here. There we go. And typos, but that's normal.
On the first bullet, it should be and similar for dispose async. It's a different pattern, but it should still use the pattern.
I'll call this out. All right, anything else? Are people happy with that? Everybody? Silence is consent. That's how that works here.
Thank you very much, guys.
Thank you. And then enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you very much. Evening.
Or evening, yeah. Whatever it is right now.
Yeah, Berlin. Bye-bye.
Cheers.
Cheers.
All right. Now our compiler friends are up.
Okay, I think I can talk to this one. We're considering supporting ref fields in .NET 7. That's fields that hold managed references rather than values. And the API that we provide for emitting metadata, including fields, is system reflection metadata. System reflection metadata, the existing API, doesn't prevent emitting ref fields, but it also doesn't provide direct support for fields that are marked by reference or that have ref custom modifiers. If you compare the current API with the API that we support, the metadata API for emitting parameters or locals, you'll see in those cases we allow the definitions. We support definitions that can be marked by ref or have ref custom modifiers. So we're proposing a small addition to the current API. Again, this is really about consistency of the API rather than completeness, because you can still work around the current API essentially. So the style of the metadata API is to start with a blob encoder. And so I've just included just one method there. That's a bunch of methods on blob encoder.
Yeah.
And that blob encoder struct exposes methods to get other encoder structs for definitions at that level, including fields. So I'm sorry, I didn't include it here in the API proposal, but the blob encoder already exposes a method for emitting a field. It's called field signature. And that method emits a byte token for the field definition, and then it returns a signature type encoder struct that can then be used to encode the field type. Again, it doesn't directly support the by ref modifier or ref custom modifiers, which is the reason for this proposal.
Yeah.
So the proposed addition is that method and the struct that I have there. So I'm proposing adding a field type encoder struct, and the shape of the struct exactly matches, or almost exactly matches, the struct for local variables and for parameter types, but for local variable type encoder and for parameter type encoder. And then there will be a method on an additional method on blob encoder. I've called it field type encoder, but maybe it should be called field. It would return the field, an instance of this field type encoder struct. So I showed a sample usage below. So you're given in this example usage, you're given an encoder essentially. From that encoder, you want to emit a field. In this case, I'm emitting a field that's a ref int type, and it has a single ref custom modifier. So I get the field type encoder from the blob encoder, and from that field encoder, I can call it custom modifiers, which returns yet another struct, which allows me to emit the ref custom modifier. And from the original field encoder, I can mark that it's that the type is by ref, and that will give me then a signature type encoder back, and I can then emit the type.
How do you get a parameter type encoder today?
I think you'd have to go several levels deep. You'd have to get a method signature encoder, and then from the method signature encoder, you can get a parameters encoder, I think, and from there you get an individual parameter type encoder.
Ah, I see. Okay, I saw it returned void, but it's an out. Okay, that makes sense. Okay, so then, yeah, it's called add parameter, and that gives you a parameter type encoder.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was just wondering because the blob encoder didn't have it, but I guess they don't sit off the blob; they sit off the method signature. Yeah. So today, basically, when fields are emitted, there is no concept of a. I mean, clearly they have types today, right? How are they being emitted today?
So there is a method on blob encoder called field signature. Field signature that returns a signature type encoder. So you're basically you're going right to that type section that I have in the field type encoder. I see. That field signature method, it does two things. It emits a token, a single byte token to the stream, to the blob, saying that we're starting a field definition, and then it returns that signature type encoder for then emitting the type of the field. But that's all you can do. That type can include custom modifiers on the type, but not ref custom modifiers.
I see. And so that means now in the future, basically, if it's ref based, you would use this one. If it's not, you use the other one, or can you use this new one for both?
You could use this new one for both. You could.
Yeah, that makes sense. Because it also works for parameters, yeah.
And the ref custom modifier stuff is potentially important if while C# does not make extreme use of custom modifiers, languages like C++, CLI make obscene use of them. And there's existing if you look at how their model works today, they already, in terms of parameter spaces, they do make use of custom if people are unaware, there's a distinction between custom modifiers on the ref and on the value. And C++ makes use of that distinction today in parameters. And if they take up support for ref fields, it will it seems completely plausible and very likely that they would make the same use on fields as they do on parameters.
So let me echo what you just said and try. You can see whether that makes sense. You basically are saying, regardless of what C# does, let's say C# doesn't support it, exporting this API still makes sense because it's an IL concept, and we just haven't done the work before because we didn't happen to use it ourselves.
Right.
Yeah.
Because this is ref fields. The reason there's no API for this is ref fields didn't exist. Like it would have been kind of nonsense to provide this API in the past. You would be saying, let me build something that the runtime doesn't support. But now that the runtime supports it, this is the API to basically say, hey, we support this now. Let's actually go and build it and run it.
Oh, so ref is actually just a modifier?
Ref is a modifier on a Chuck can say a little more detail, but ref is a modifier in a signature, and you can put custom modifiers on the ref or on the value that it refers to.
Is it also true for parameters, or is it just because?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
So the way that we encode locals is basically exactly how we encode parameters and fields.
Interesting.
But just fields have never existed until .NET 7 as ref. So this is just a new concept. But the way we did it was we said, like, literally, it's like, just take how we do locals and parameters, just do it as a field.
Makes sense. Yeah, I always thought that ref was just an IL concept on top of the signature, but didn't know it was a modifier. Learn something new?
I gotta tell you, it's something that the Roslyn team, we kind of knew, but had to relearn when we deployed Roslyn to Windows, where they use C++ CLI, and it's like, oh, we're not mapping signatures correctly because we're missing that mods can be on both sides here.
Yeah, so in terms of API, I think it makes sense. Honestly, I don't care what you call the blob encoder method, because I think any name would be fine so long it starts with field. I guess field type encoder makes sense. People have to choose between field signature and field type encoder, but I guess the way you choose is by knowing how this thing works, so I don't know what else to do. The shape of field type encoder makes sense, you just mirrored what parameter type encoder does. So I would just keep that in sync, no matter what I think about the naming here. So yeah. Anybody else? Any questions, concerns? Wow.
I think regarding the name, it's more than just a field type, and so I'm now second guessing. I feel like the method name should probably be just field. That's fine.
So you're basically saying just field, nothing else. That also works. If you want people to use this over the old system, generally speaking, that would give you that, because people tend to use the shorter ones. Would be my guess. But this is an expert level API, so I also don't think this is where we are concerning ourselves with will people be successful here, because I think the only people who would call this API are on this call right now.
Yeah, I'm just, the current blob encoder type doesn't have any of the type encoders on it. Like it has local variable signature, but not local variable type encoder, because local variable type encoder comes from a different factory elsewhere or is just directly consumed. So I'm just curious if blob encoder is the right place for this, or if it should be on the blob encoder.field signature. Like, should that be the thing that's returning? Should that have I want the field type encoder? I don't really care. I'm just doing due diligence here.
The problem is that the thing that gives you, so basically what field signature gives you today is a generic signature encoder, right? That wouldn't know whether it's a field or not. You can't put it off of that.
Fair enough.
But
okay. Asymmetry sounds justified then.
Yeah, it's less asymmetric. It's more about, the composition of the IL, layering of the different kinds of, basically binary stuff that happens there, right? But yeah.
That was my only question.
So then, I think this is the only comment that we had then. Do we have to, by the way, do we actually have to do anything in metadata load context to accommodate that change? Probably not, right?
That would have been done as a part of Aaron. So that's kind of on the runtime side of things. And I believe that Aaron's already, like, I can check later to see if Aaron added that as one of the items that he was tracking for ref support, but he was pretty thorough. I think he got all the cases, but I can check later and see if he got metadata load context.
I am here. I was able to show him.
Oh, there's Aaron. He can tell us if he did it.
So this is... I have not actually run a scenario with it, but it is just respecting the underlying metadata element _ref type. And so if the API accepts any of those low-level types, they can just adorn a field with that. So there should be no change here, other than the fact I have not been able to run. I have not checked if the API explicitly blocks that, but I would be very surprised if it does. I can easily check that though. But there should be no API changes, I think, is the broader point
Gotcha.
here.
All right. Sweet. All right.
Thanks, everyone.
Then thanks to the compiler people.
Thank you.
Okay, next it looks, this one is mine.
This looks familiar. Didn't we look at, I mean, I didn't see any comments on it, but I swear we looked at something like that before.
Exactly. Yeah, this is what I was going to say. Okay. So this one, a few weeks ago, we have already approved some APIs that help enumerating the properties inside the activity class. If you remember, I mean, this is mainly was for performance reason. I mean, like how we can return like kind of enumerators that it doesn't allocate, and also it will be fast not copying the structs or the items inside the enumerator. So we already approved these APIs in the activity class, and the API is mainly just like you calling it, it returns the types, the new types that we approved it. It's called, we called it activity.enumerator, which is implement get enumerator and current and whatever. Yeah, so basically the API proposal here is doing the same inside the activity event and inside the activity link classes. So we will have one API to enumerate the tags inside the activity events and another API to enumerate the tags inside the activity links. Exactly the same way we did in the activity class. Those will be the last two APIs and such kind. I mean, like we looked at the whole code base, and those are the only two remaining ones that we need. Those actually affecting the allocation during the exportation. I mean, when you export the trace stuff in the OpenTelemetry SDK. So if we have these two APIs, so this means that the exporter will be allocation free, fully allocation free. We got some measurement actually down there at the end of the issue. I mean, showing the differences and how this is very useful for to avoid the allocation during the exportation. Yeah, so that's all. So the signature of the proposal of this method is exactly the same as what we have in the activity class that we already approved.
So that itself raises kind of a question on activity. There's tags and there's tag objects. So the naming's kind of funny. We use the same name on these guys, enumerate tag objects, but they don't have that same quirk. There's just tags. So the name is a little bit debatable. I'd like to get feedback on that here.
I prefer consistency with activity class. I mean, so it will be consistent to be like, if anybody using activity, so they will be familiar with this name.
I kind of agree. Yeah, the consistency is nice.
So I think last time we talked about this, and I don't actually recall where we were landing on this, but we talked about this, and basically the takeaway was we are okay with it if the perf gain is significant enough, right? Is that a fair summary, or did I miss something?
Yeah, that's right. And we have already done the measurements, and we see the big difference for the allocations. I mean, so the way that OpenTelemetry work during the exporting the stuff, I mean, like they collect the stuff and they spend like 15 minutes just exporting whatever they collected. And if we are allocating during that time, the allocation will be very costly. And we already measured that.
I mean, how many gigabytes does that write? If it takes 15 minutes, that's quite a bit. Yeah, I believe that. I mean, like if this is, I mean, this was basically the question, right? Is that like, if this is on a hot path, I think it makes sense. I mean, we do optimize enumerators, right, elsewhere in the framework when we think there's a hot path. It just comes at the expense of some complexity, right? And I mean, it's basically like if you look at the sample code here, it's kind of showing that, right? It's not your grandma's, for each statement, right? It's a bit more involved. But I think that, if there's significant perf gains to be had, I think I don't have a massive objection to that.
Tarek, I had a quick question, which is the activity numerator type is forever going to be the correct type for this, right? Like we're never going to need to change the iterator behavior under the covers in the future, correct?
Yeah. This is our. Yeah.
Okay, just double checking that tying it to the type was appropriate.
Yeah.
So it's only for tags, it's for nothing else?
Yeah, I mean, activity links and activity events doesn't have any other enumerator, in other objects like this. So it's just tags, yes.
Yeah, so the only question I have is like, what happens if we need to add another thing, right, that you want to enumerate? So should we call this tag enumerator just to make that easier? Because if you call it enumerator and then later on there's something else you want to enumerate that has a slightly different shape, then you may regret that.
So we are not exposing a new type. So activity to enumerator is already what we expose. So we are trying to avoid exposing a new type.
Ah. Interesting.
Yeah, so activity enumerator is already approved and exposed in activity.
I see. We already use it for events and links, right? And now you're using it for tag objects as well.
Right. Yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah. Then I have even fewer concerns. Right. Anybody else?
Excellent.
Alrighty, then that was easy. Alright, async enumerable.
Hey, that should be mine. Okay,
Hello.
so hello. Long story short, in .NET 6 we shipped source generators and we also shipped async enumerable, but we didn't have the time to add support for async enumerable in SourceGen, so we want to do that in 7, and that needs a few APIs. The first new method is just an overload that lets you pass source-generated metadata into a root level deserialize async enumerable method. And if you scroll down a bit, the second edition concerns just creating set metadata by the source generator. So these are APIs that are consumed solely by the source generator. And again, fairly straightforward additions to make this happen.
So was the only problem we ran out of time, or was there anything else?
We were just out of time, really.
And so there are no gotchas with this API. It just works the way you would expect.
Yep.
Come on, you make it too easy to approve. There must be something here. Okay, I mean, yeah, it seems reasonable. And unless somebody has a question or concern, I mean, I don't know what else to do with this. It's just an overload. It's consistent with the other pattern that we have done for source chain, so there's really not much to say about that.
Yep.
All right, then this is it.
Thank you very much.
Now I feel like a paper pusher. All right, so I guess now we're out of agenda items. So I guess any preferences on what to tackle next? Otherwise, we'll just
There's another JSON one in the list.
Yeah, then let's look at this. Which one? The first one?
First one, yeah. So that one we were very close to approving last year, but we kind of decided not to go ahead with it. And that was only because it concerns new types that don't exist in Net Standard 2.0. We weren't exactly sure how we were going to solve this problem, but as it happens, there now is prior art that kind of shows how we are supposed to do this, like, for example, in CBOR.
Yeah, just I want to mention that this is important. I mean, there is a demand on this. I mean, many people is waiting for it.
I mean, the solution is basically you surround the code with if net 6 or greater, right?
Basically, no support for these types in the Net Standard 2.0 build.
I mean, if we were to ship them as an out of band, which I don't think we would for these two types, but then, yeah, presumably you could expose them, but you would just make those two properties conditional for the frameworks that have it, right? I mean, yeah, I mean, that seems reasonable. I think my question is basically, what does it mean now when when I just take the defaults? Can I serialize now date only or time only, or do I have to add the converter somewhere?
At the moment, you mean?
Well, okay, let's say if I create a .NET 7 app, right, and I serialize my JSON, do I have to do something special to have date only and time only work?
No, you shouldn't need to.
Okay. And that applies for both source gen and reflection?
Correct.
Okay.
So currently or once we add this? Because I thought that the source generation would fail because it wouldn't find a public converter for it.
So in 6 it currently throws, but in 7, assuming that we do add this, it should work out of the box, no flags required.
Okay. Yeah, so that's matching my expectation.
And so how does this work? Is this like a naming convention that if you find a corresponding converter on the metadata services, you use it, or is it just it's wired into the converter somewhere?
It's wired into the source generator, so it knows when it does encounter the specific type that the special API is called this, call into that.
So if I know, okay, now let's say I do .NET Standard 2.0 still, right, with JSON, and I happen to define my own date only types, then it will still handle that gracefully and not just, generate code that can't compile, right?
I mean, if it's a POCO, it will generate it as a POCO. Right. If it's something different, who knows?
Right.
I mean, if you named it system.dateOnly and they've matched it by type name, then it might produce code that doesn't compile. But don't declare types in system.
I guess that's fair.
I would assume that we wouldn't be generating identical code in the Net Standard 2.0 build for the source generator.
Yeah. But I think Jeremy is right. I think I generally don't care when people do that. It's just that, we have to, I think, live with the fact that some people will do that.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes we end up with, it matches a type based on does this live in, using the assembly that defined string, go find a thing called system.dateOnly. And then sometimes it's just find a type called global system date only. And I don't know which one it's using there for the match, but it'll either not match or it'll produce non-compiling code, and that's what you get for defining your own type called system.dataOnly.
And I would usually say when we handle this, we should usually say, you know, global type search, but then we would just say, okay, we expect that type to have a certain shape, because if you named your own copy system.dataOnly and it does not adhere to the contract that we're looking for, well, then that's on you, right? But I think the idea is that if we want to make things out of band, or if we want to make, you know, certain things like nullable just work when they're like, you know, emitted into the assembly, then we just match by name. Usually we don't care what assembly types are in for the most part, because we know that's the one thing we do mess with all the time with stuff like so. The fewer things we match by assembly is the better we're off usually.
Indeed.
But I think, yeah, there's an expectation that the fully qualified type name is matching, that the type adheres to the contract that we expect.
Yep.
So Eric, is this is the first time we've had to split the ref for JSON?
For JSON, yes.
I'm pretty sure that the tooling that we have in the build now will detect if we get into the bad state where we end up overwriting the local with missing API. But yeah, I think it should be fine.
Sorry, when you say the bad state, what does that mean?
This is where you doodle all the NuGet TFMs and dependency flows and end up with a way that I think the only problem would be it's if you add an API in net standard.
You mean a TFM hole in the package graph?
Yeah, something like if they add a new method now in the net standard ref, that the net standard version will lose in unification to inbox, and if they get a forward package, that may obliterate. So things get weird, but as long as it's all resolved correctly during build time, it should work. It's only some complicated, you did a version roll forward on your application that goes wonky.
It should just work. We have package validation that's running in as part of the build, specifically for this one, because this is actually a package. So we're definitely doing that. The one thing that we have to check is I'm not sure if we're packaging the .NET 7 asset, or if that one we just have a placeholder because it's coming out of the framework. I believe we are actually packaging the .NET 7 asset as well. So at that point, yes, that thing has all the checks in place so that you're not breaking your own API between compatible frameworks. So we do all those. We don't have all of the rules. So like you could still be breaking, like for example, we don't do attribute checking, things like that. But at least for APIs, yes, we do all of the checks in there, and we make sure that you're not shooting yourself in the foot.
Another side question, it's good discussion here about, can we make this also work for .NET 6? Because like I'm not seeing any problem if we have this APIs exposed for .NET 6.
You mean should we backport this?
Not backporting, but my understanding is like you can reference .NET 6. I mean the system text JSON from .NET 7 system text JSON from .NET 6 app, right?
Yeah, I suppose if we ship the V7 version of system text JSON in NuGet, the Net 6.0 TFM should include this functionality. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah.
I guess it depends on we'd still be building a Net 6 asset so that it doesn't roll backwards with respect to the runtime if somebody hits the V6 runtime with the V7 package. So.
No, that's. I mean, the unification is based on the version of the assembly, right, or version of the package, I should say, right. So if you ship a newer version of this package that has more features in the Net 6 TFM, it just means that, you know, at runtime you will not use the Net 6 inbox version of system text JSON. You use the one that came with the app, and that one has that feature.
Right, but if we shipped the package, and we're talking a little bit about the build system here, but just making sure that Joe doesn't say that, no, this is insane and not how we work. If we shipped the new package out of the 7 branch, and we included a Net 7 DLL, but not a Net 6 DLL,
right?
Then when you restored that package against a V6 runtime, it would see that there's not a Net 6, so then it would look for Net 5, 3.1, etc. And if it didn't have any of those, then it's going to pull the Net standard one sideways, because that's the best match it found for that TFM, because you only had forward references. So I think we build complicatedly, and I think that out of the V7 branch, we'll have a V6 native, or we'll have a V6 compile and a V7 compile, just so we don't end up in this hole.
That's correct.
Thank you. I understand how packaging works a little bit. Yay. So the answer is, as long as the TFM split doesn't say net 7, if it says not net standard, then this would flow backwards via packaging, and that's fine.
Yeah. That's a feature, not a bug. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, then. Sweet.
Thank you.
All right. Next one.
We do
I've got
a
stream one.
I was gonna say, should we just go in order?
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to do it in any order as long as people can talk to the issue.
So the title of this kind of outdated, but it's not as much as possible anymore. But so since .NET 1 stream read takes in a buffer, and two of the things about stream read is that there might be more things in the stream than what it returns, right? So if like a web request or a network stream, like you might get partial read back, because it reads until it returns 0 basically, and you kind of have to wrap it in a loop. And then the other thing is that streams also aren't guaranteed to completely fill up the buffer before they get passed back. And so basically, if you're looking for, I need to read a certain amount of bytes before I can start making progress on this stream, you have to wrap your stream reads in a loop and always check to see, did you get enough data in order to make progress.
Yep.
And in .NET 6, we actually changed a couple built-in streams, the 3 that were listed there, to not fill up the buffer before it returns, but to act like some of the others, to act like these other streams that only return as much bytes as they have today. And so this API proposal is basically making a new API on stream that allows the caller to say, I need this many bytes. Don't return until you give me at least this many bytes. Oh. And so proposing the name read at least. And so there'd be a read at least and a read at least async. And it takes in the buffer, an int, the minimum number of bytes. And then the one kind of quirky thing is what to do when you hit the end of the stream before you get the minimum bytes back. And there's kind of 3-ish high-level options. The first one would be to throw, to say, end of stream, throw, I didn't get enough bytes. Another would be to not throw and just return, well, you said the minimum bytes was 10. There was only 8 left in the stream, so I just returned 8. And then kind of the third option is kind of what I'm proposing here, is to add an option between these, so that way callers can declare up front what they want this API to do. And so just looking in our own BCL code, there's places where throw on end of stream is acceptable, and there's places where don't throw on the end of the stream because I want to do something special, like throw my own exception or set a flag, so that way somewhere else I see that the end of stream has happened, etc.
Yeah, so I mean, we generally say in the guidelines don't have parameters that control throwing, even though we have that. And I think Reflection has it all over the place, but that was a thing done before we had this guidance. The problem, of course, is that I think if we wouldn't have the parameter, then I would say the only sensible behavior is not throwing and just leave it to the caller, because that seems more desirable than catching and then throwing a different exception.
So what needs to happen there then, that every caller needs to check,
right?
Did I get, and it's kind of unfortunate because, I mean, I guess the only way it will ever return less than minimum bytes is if you did hit the end of the stream, but you still need to check. And where, like, if you scroll down to my example, like I've written this code myself, or example 1, where it's like I I'm parsing something out of from a protocol, right? And it says, you know, the next 8 bytes represent something. So I make a buffer of some sort that's 8 bytes long, and I say, okay, read in that many bytes, and you have to wrap that in a while loop, right? So in order to the happy path for like normal callers would just want, like, if I don't expect there to only be 6 bytes in this stream. If there is, just throw, because I can't, you know, the protocol's off.
I agree with that. It's just that in almost all cases, I want to control the exception. But I think yes.
If you're a library developer, yeah. But I think I think a lot of times you don't really. Well,
I mean, possible, yeah.
A typical developer, right, where it's just it's you know, ill-formed data that I've been getting in. I needed 10 bytes here, and and there isn't 10 bytes in the stream. Would you really want to throw your own exception each time to say, I didn't get enough bytes, I didn't get enough bytes here?
I mean, I would say that most people that do this kind of work where you parse binary formats, you're writing a library. Like, I mean, there's not many app developers who parse a binary format and read from a spec and say, oh, the next 4 bytes are this, the next 12 bytes are this, right? Like, it's a kind of I think it's a very specialized use case that is mostly done by library developers, I think.
But Timo, what's the reason? Sorry, what's the reason for that guideline about not having a pool? I understand, like in the reflection APIs, it's annoying because it impacts the nullability of the return object. What's the relevance to an API like this?
I think Jeremy might know more.
I've actually been searching in the book to find it. So the guideline, the specific wording, do not have public members that can either throw or not based on some option. There's no prose that Christoph wrote for it, but there's an annotation from Brad. An API such as this one, which is type.getType, usually reflects the inability of the designer to make a decision. A method either completes successfully or it does not, in which case it should throw an exception. Failure to decide forces the decision on the caller, who likely does not have enough context on the implementation detail to make an informed decision.
So given that, and the name of the API is read at least, shouldn't it theoretically just throw always if it doesn't? Like if it read at most X bytes, I would understand not throwing, but read at least, doesn't that kind of imply, well, if you don't have enough,
right? So if we didn't need an async version here, the answer would be easy. It would be try read at least, and it would return false and tell you how much it did. But the which would be weird because you basically wouldn't ever care about the return.
Right.
So if you take Brad's annotation, right, of what you said, that you're forcing the caller to know what to do here. Like that's exactly why I'm proposing the Boolean, is because the simple case is like I just wanted to throw when I hit the end of the stream. I didn't expect the end of the stream to happen. And so if we don't provide the Boolean and we say read at least can return less than what the minimum that you provided, then the caller always has to do like example 2 basically.
I think that's fair.
And if anything, the description that was written there was basically saying we couldn't make up our minds or we didn't understand the scenarios enough, so we decided to allow both of them. This is sort of the opposite of that. We know that there are cases for both, right, and we now have optional parameters at our disposal. So we can basically make the default case be the always throw thing, but allow someone who knows they don't want the exception to override it. By specifying false.
Yeah, I mean, like that's why I was searching for what we actually said here, because it feels to me like this is natural enough, because the Boolean is just saying, should we embed this? Like, there's a very common check here. Should we embed it for you? Like maybe you just have an algorithm of like, oh, well, the moment that you don't get another successful block of 1024, now you're in do final, and so you have the if yourself, and so, but it's different than everybody else's. Well, I have a 4K header. If I don't get 4K, I don't have a header, so throw. So I think both are valid. and it's easy to understand what it's doing. So I think this may be the 1 in 1,000 that is exempt from the do not.
I mean, the other option would be two methods. Two separate methods.
Yeah.
Yeah. I may be missing something, but why not have like a read at least that always throws, and then a try read at least, which won't throw?
Because we don't have a try pattern for async.
Yeah, we'd have to solve it for async, right? And if you do the Boolean there, you might as well do the Boolean for the other one.
Got it.
I think let me just roll back for a second. Like, whatever we just said, I buy this argument, but I have a hard problem now coming up with an example where what Brett said is true in the context of throwing. Like, it seems the caller always knows whether you want this to fail or not. In fact, the caller is the only party that has that information.
Going with Steve's, so let's pretend you believe that nullable annotations are valuable and useful, etc. That now that we can say, hey, be aware this may return null. Because it feels like that we probably had type stuff throwing, and then people wanted to do opportunistic, and the exceptions were expensive. So then it was like, fine, there's a Boolean, but we still want, and then we can't make a default because, well, maybe you wouldn't have expected null. Maybe you would have thought it was the throwing that we did in the previous preview, or 1.0, or I don't know what the history there is. But if it says, hey, this might return null, then whatever. And now it screws up the analysis. It actually screws up nullability analysis on things like type.getType, which is it can't return null if you give it true.
No, I think we can express that, right? Not null if true or something. Can we not put this on a parameter? I thought we could.
No, we not well.
We have that an out won't be null if the return of the method is true, but I don't think we have the return of a method won't be null if a parameter was true.
And that would basically be the attribute introduced specifically for type. It wasn't common enough to warrant the C# team doing something about it. It was below the cut line.
Gotcha. But I mean, we could solve it if it were becoming a pattern, right? But I think the problem, like, if you go back, right, it's kind of like the counter argument to Brett's point, though, right? Because if you have to make a decision and you encode it by basically saying we're not throwing, we just give you null. But in V1, the type system didn't have annotations to begin with, so you just had to know that type get type could give you null. Then giving you a Boolean is actually better because, well, you told us what to do, right? So like, if you pass in true, you get null. If you pass false, then we will throw, right? So that seems much more of a counter to Brett's argument than in support of his argument, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because there is definitely some goodness for standardized exceptions, but there's also, don't throw the exception if you want. And if we wanted to follow the guideline as written, then basically we would have read at least and read eagerly, and the difference is, do they throw?
I think if we have to rephrase it, right, to me it would be like, don't have APIs that specify bool throw, prefer the try pattern, right? And then we would say, well, in this case we can't use the try pattern, or we could, but we could only do it for half of the APIs, so we're deciding to go with the Boolean pattern, right? Which seems like a sensible decision. I mean, that's really the only argument against throw, in my opinion, is that we have a try pattern.
We could also try and bite the bullet and invent the try async pattern, which presumably would be value tuple of Boolean and the value, but I don't think that we want to do that today.
Yeah, I don't want to do Go. But yeah, I mean, it's certainly true that is the only way we could do it.
Levi's got his hand up.
Yeah, so I had two questions, actually. The first was, do we have streams within the ecosystem whose read methods return 0 to indicate I don't have anything for you right now, but I'm not yet closed?
You're only allowed to do that if the buffer.length is 0. Or sorry, okay. No. If buffer.length is 0, yeah, that's you can block for data or not, because it's a case that the method can't really describe.
Okay, so this method won't run into a degenerate case where it gets confused and inadvertently does that mechanism then. The second question I had was, do we have streams within the ecosystem where you have to pass a minimum buffer length to the read method in order for it to do anything whatsoever useful. Like this stream has to take, for instance, 10 bytes minimum to its read method.
No, because stream.read byte just creates a byte 1 and calls read.
Okay, perfect. I had asked because this method, if those types existed prominently within the ecosystem, this method would have an interesting time trying to call those APIs.
Yeah, I mean, somebody may have written one, but it would certainly be not standard, and the API doesn't lend itself toward it.
Okay, so we would consider that a bug then. Okay.
I assume, Eric, the intent is that if you pass in, well, what is your intention around minimum length of buffer and minimum value of bytes to read? Can they be empty and 0?
Well, I guess what I was concerned about is say that I have an API whose contract, for whatever weird reason, is like the buffer that's passed in has to be at least 8 bytes for me to be able to read anything useful into it. Like I'll say throw if you pass in less than that. And then I call read at least 10 bytes, for instance. It populates, 8 bytes and then says, oh, I have 2 more bytes I need to populate. And then it calls read again in a loop and then crashes. Like if that's not something that ever happens, if we would consider that a bug, this is all great.
I think we'd consider that a bug, and it would be up to the responsibility of the stream to buffer the extra data that it wants to hand back the next time.
I agree.
Perfect.
But I still am curious, Eric, what do you think this should be doing? If someone passes in a buffer of length 0 or bytes to read 0, what do you think it should do?
Yep. So my initial kind of things about this is bytes to read can't be negative, and it can't be more than the length of the buffer. And
I guess the question is, are you going to write it as while bytes to read is greater than 0, or is it do while?
It's a do while. Like,
okay.
Read at least will ensure at least one call to read. Is how I've written it so far. And so for 0 length and 0 bytes to read, I would, at least what it does now is it calls stream.read with a 0 length buffer, and then one time, and then returns.
I think that's the most consistent thing we could do. That I think that makes sense.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking.
Yeah, write a test for that.
For sure.
And I guess the expectation is that all the streams that do buffering, that's already expressed in the read method, so we don't have to make this virtual.
So that is it's on. I guess I put it under alternative designs, but so the number 2 bullet is about virtual. I did look through the streams we had. There was one that was potential. Like at first I thought there wasn't any that would ever need to override this, but there's one that has potential, which is the pipe reader stream. And so this is system IO pipelines. So because pipe reader has a read at least method, and this stream is just a wrapper over top of the pipe, there would be, at least would be conceivable that you'd want to be able to override stream read at least and then just call pipe reader read at least underneath the covers. But pipelines only have asynchronous APIs, and so it kind of fell apart a little bit that, well, you couldn't override read at least the synchronous API. You'd only be able to do that optimization on the async one. But that was the only one that I could find that was even. And kind of my reasoning, so back up a little bit on to number 2. My reasoning is you already get the buffer passed. So it's kind of like if you wanted a hint on how much data is being requested, you could use the buffer length if you wanted to. And then the first bullet is like we could add the virtual API later if we wanted to. If there was like overwhelming, we could make a new.
Just making the existing non-virtual method virtual in the future.
No.
Well, we'd add the protected core.
Right, we'd add a protected core, and then the non-virtual one would call the protected core.
I think you wouldn't even have to do that. I'm pretty sure you could, in a non-breaking fashion, make this virtual in the future, because if there's an existing call site, then it will simply bind to the base implementation, which would, in a loop, call read.
I'll let you and Jared have that argument.
but there's parameter validation, right? Like the bytes to read can't be greater than the length, etc. So like that, our pattern is to do the parameter validation in non-virtual way and then call the virtual.
Okay. Yes. Fair.
Yeah.
Fair. Okay.
So virtual is a good question.
Because the only
right now,
thing that it would really be saving is having having a virtual method here of the core pattern or straight would be that it lets something like pipe reader move the while into their code to maybe reduce one or two virtual dispatches, but you had to add an extra virtual dispatch to do it, so it seems like it's probably not worth it.
Yeah, the pipe reader is interesting because you don't give it a buffer, right? You say read, and it reads however much it thinks, and then returns you the sequence.
Yeah, I'm looking at the pipe reader implementation, and it is implemented by a while loop, same as we would effectively be doing. But like, I'm wondering, are there just like raw network stacks where you can tell the network card directly, like, don't even return until you've filled up this buffer. Like, don't even bother taking OS resources until you have filled it entirely. Is that a thing?
It's not on sockets, like at least from what I saw on socket, no. But I don't know of other technologies.
I mean, so I don't see an immediate reason that we would have it be virtual, and there's a way that we can add it later. So I think that just understanding that we could add it later if we found a justification is good enough.
Okay. And then maybe I shouldn't have put this under alternative designs, but it felt like it. So the original thing about this issue was they wanted an API to read as much as possible, or like fill a whole buffer, basically. And so I've thought about a convenience wrapper that would be called something like read all or fill, that doesn't take the minimum bytes and just uses the buffer length. So that way you pass in a buffer and it's like read this whole buffer of stuff, and that way you don't have to pass in buffer.length. It's simple to do yourself by passing in buffer.length, and I didn't like that they wouldn't be overloads, because we wouldn't call it read at least and then you just pass in a buffer. And then again, we could also always add this one later. So I at least wanted to just bring that up to see if people had strong opinions either way.
I'm curious. I mean, I think what you have is fine. I'm curious if you considered making the minimum bytes optional, and if it was some sentinel, like if the default value of -1 or something, we would special case that to mean buffer.length.
I guess I haven't really considered it.
I was about to say the same thing.
I don't know if it's warranted, but that is one way we could kind of get both. If by default, if you just specified a buffer, we'd fill it. If you then wanted to specify a minimum value, you actually specify that.
I mean, if you look at the parsing handle case, that seems the most desirable, right? If you want to exact 4 bytes in order to read an int, then it makes sense to create the span up front and then just call whatever parse method you have over that buffer afterwards, right?
Yes and no. I mean, if generally, if you were targeting a network stream, you don't want to just read 1 byte from the socket or 4 bytes from the socket. So you typically have, you need 4 bytes because it's the next part of the protocol, but you want your read to be as productive as possible. So you give it your whole 8K buffer, but you say, I at least need 4 bytes.
Almost seems like you want to stream in between then. That basically reads at large chunks, but then you can call read at least against that guy. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, but if you're the protocol handler, right? Like you could yourself have a 4K buffer, and you're like, well, the next thing I'm going to do is read an int, so read at least 4. And if the stream, because you give it a 4K buffer and you ask for 4, it's allowed to write 4K. It's just not allowed to write 3.
Right. I mean, it just means that you need to have that the complexity is now more in the parser, right?
Yeah.
But yeah. That's
Yeah,
fair.
I think if we're going to do a sentinel, I know normally we do -1. I'd probably do int.min value because -1 just seems too easy to have been a math error in context.
Yeah, but that looks really ugly in signature. Help. Because it
Well,
won't render
even-
it in min value. It renders at like, you know, minus 2 billion, right?
Yeah.
What
And now
about-
it looks like the compiler blew up.
I don't know if I really like the ergonomics of stream.read@least buffer. But if others think it's valuable,
I think what you have is fine, and we can see if there's pain associated with it. It shouldn't be a breaking change to make it optional in the future if we want to.
it would be if
There-
it was a negative.
There's no
number.
formal parameter after it. Yeah.
If it was if the sentinel value would be a negative number, it would go from throwing an exception to not throwing an exception.
Right. Which we generally consider to be an okay change.
We'd use nullable int if we could. I mean, we couldn't make that happen.
Well, I mean, actually, you could say read@least takes a nullable int. And pass null if you just want to use the string length. But yeah, it does feel, again, weird. Read@least buffer comma null. It's like, what?
Or even just read@least buffer. I guess I can kind of get it in my head. It's reading at least the full buffer.
Yeah.
I think that might be confusing to people who just want to pass in an array, though, because I think most people still don't really understand spans and memories, so they'll end up passing an array and have it implicitly converted.
Well, I was going to get to that. It's stream is a CS 101 type, which means usually we're nice in the overloads and give you an array option when there's a span option. But then we would need to do offset and maximum. And so do we want to do that complexity here or not?
I mean, I would say yes.
Yeah. Really?
Yeah, because I mean, like arguably the current stream APIs are, you know, a pit or failure, right? Because most people that call read expect that it has the behavior, but it doesn't, right? So it's this is kind of the more usable version of that, right? Because it does the loop for you. And quite frankly, yeah, most people don't use spans. And it's like, it's not really a lot of complexity, right? It's just overloads, and they don't have to be virtual because they can all just go to the virtual span one, right? Like for us,
So
it's
we're gonna
totally free.
We're gonna have an overload that takes 3 ints in a row. That is in itself a difficult thing to work with.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
because it'd be
I
buffer,
don't really wanna
offset,
break into jail here.
length, and minimum.
And you could just call array.slice.
Yeah, if
int,
you're in C#,
int.
yeah.
Yeah, like if you have a method that takes an array, then presumably somebody would just pass an offset and a length, and that is the buffer to be filled. Like there's no point to passing an additional minimum argument. That said, I think
there is. That's you're not allowed to write past this boundary, but I may only
that would be
super care that you write 4.
Byte array, comma offset, comma length. Like that is the boundary you're allowed to write into.
That's the boundary, but that's the case of I want to read as much as you're willing to give me, but I need it to be at least 4.
Oh yes, because you're right. It won't actually stop once it hits the minimum. It has permission to go forward if it needs to. Fair enough.
Right.
Yeah, because I really don't want to break into jail and start adding a whole bunch of overloads here. Like I think the common case might be, you know, people just write at the beginning of the array, which means that the overload that's proposed here would actually be appropriate for them.
Yeah, I mean, I think if so, you know, we could look here. If we wanted to add read all, I think read all would be fine for the array. We would take read, we would overload it to read all. And so it's here's an array and an offset and a length. And those would be fine. But I agree with Steve that the 3 ints in a row feels like also, we said we're being nice to people, but we then gave them 3 ints in a row.
Also in VB, you can't declare spans, but you can call methods that accept spans and call and have one of the arguments produce a span. Like in VB, I could call read@least array.asSpan, right? That would work.
That is my understanding.
And same in F#.
Well, F# has support for spans as far as I can tell.
So what language couldn't this work with?
Well, all the other ones that in theory exist, right? But I mean, for sure, like in practical terms, what we care about is VB, I guess. I mean, it's more like, I mean, I think this is a different thing. I think we should not like revisit the entire guideline that we have for this API. Like either we believe that we do overload based on those things, or we don't, but I would not change it for just this one API.
Well, I'm suggesting that the guideline is saying that for very common things, it should, you know, it makes sense that you want to be able to use them with arrays and languages that don't support declaring locals of type span. But this particular API doesn't require you to declare a local of span. Just requires, you know, if you have a buffer, you just want to pass in a slice of it, and in all the languages we're aware of, you can do that.
Sure, but that's usually not how we have done it in the past, right? So when we had APIs that took span of char, for example, we have added a string overload, even though you can, in many cases, just pass the string.
That's it's about the people who don't know what span is, and I have an array. How do I fill this array? And it's the now you have to learn this step. But I mean, so the question is, do we think that read at least is a power user scenario or a common scenario? And
I would assert that most people that call read really want read at least. They just don't know it until that gives them back less than they asked for.
Well, honestly, most people who call, based on the feedback we got after CryptoStream doing only return as much data as you have without needing to call read another time, is that most people seem to want read all.
So read all meaning fill the entire buffer.
That the value that they want for minimum is always the buffer.
No, that one I believe. Like I'm just saying, like you know, read at least compared to read, right? You're just arguing whether we need the int parameter that takes the minimum size being different from the buffer, right? And that one I agree with. So I could get behind the, you know, we have read all and we have read at least, and then read all we overload and read at least we don't. I think that
that was my suggestion.
Yeah, that one I could get behind.
I think that's okay.
So yeah, read all would be read at least minus the minimum, because the minimum would be buffer.length. And then we would take that one and we could give that one it takes a span, or it takes a byte array, or it takes a byte array and an offset in the length. And
yep,
great. We gave you all your little overloads. Now you're happy.
It also,
if you want to call read at least, now you're being a little complicated. Now you need to learn what a span is.
Does read all throw on the end of the stream?
I think it'd just take the same Boolean.
So I wanted to draw attention to something that I put in chat. I don't think read all is a good name for an API, because I naively would expect that to read the entire stream.
Yeah, that's
not
true.
A fill buffer equivalent.
Fair enough. So read completely.
Well, that has the same problem.
Well, the problem with fill is then it's not next to read.
Yeah.
Read buffer? Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, so read at least is good because it lives next to stream, but read at least with the array overload pattern. I mean, we could reduce it to 2 by, instead of taking array offset and length, we take array segment and length, but array segment and minimum. But I don't know that stream touches array segment ever. So we'd be introducing that just to avoid the 3 ints.
Yeah, the only type that really takes array segment within the ecosystem is like WebSocket. I've never seen it on any of System.io.
Yeah, it was added for networking.
I mean,
I think it was useful. I don't know why the rest of the BCL didn't pick it up. Now that we have span, it's a little weird to start introducing it in places. But
I mean, we could do the other thing. We could just, you know, keep read at least, and then just say read at least has one overload that just takes an array, nothing else. Then you have a read at least that takes a span, and then you have a read at least that takes a span and a minimum. Because I mean, that's the more powerful user scenario where you want to pass in an 8K buffer, but still only want to read like 8 bytes.
So read at least. So you're saying read at least just array bool or array int bool?
No, array array bool.
Can you write them down? So
Yeah.
sorry.
Or you just don't. I mean, if we're really trying to keep it simple, just have it take, and we really think it needs to take an array, which I don't, but that's fine. Just have read at least array, and the overload we're talking about here. Like, don't even have throw on end of stream on the.
Yeah, something you'll want to be mindful of is that people don't treat this as read exactly. Because I could imagine a scenario where somebody, say, rents from the array pool, calls read at least. They thought they passed in, say, a 1 kilobyte array, but they inadvertently passed in a 2 kilobyte array, and then they inadvertently lose data because they don't realize that more than 1 kilobyte has been written.
Yeah.
I don't think we need to really account for that here. It's just we should be aware that that's a possibility.
I think it's a valid concern. I worry that if we were to accept the int offset and int length, we're changing the meaning of the int argument that is the second parameter when you switch between overloads.
Yep. So that's what I'm saying. I don't think people would do that. I think it's okay to say, the languages that don't support span at all, you have something you can work with. It's just not necessarily the most performant solution.
So why aren't we having the user just slice the span buffer in the case of read at least? Why are we having them pass in both the buffer and the minimum bytes?
Because you may want to say.
There are two things you're controlling. You want to make sure you get at least a certain amount, but you also want to allow the call to give you more than that if it's available.
Yeah.
Okay.
But a lot of times they are the same. That's why we're talking about.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, one of the reasons this API is interesting to me is because for generic math, we have the try-write little Indian API, which will, of course, get the entire 2's complement representation of a binary integer. However, most of the times, such as if you're doing, let's say you have an int 32, then you only need the lower 4 bytes. You don't need the entire set of bits from a big integer to do a valid cast, for example. And so there's a somewhat related scenario there where users want an API where they can effectively say try write partial, where they want to get the lowest set of bits from the backing buffer and not the entire set of bits.
So you're in support of the API, but you don't have any opinions on the shape. Is that the takeaway?
Yeah, I'm in general general support of the API, and it will be interesting to see if the same pattern here is also a pattern that will work for the generic math scenario, or something similar at least.
I think Levi's concern is a valid one, and I still question the validity of the API that just takes a byte array.
Yeah, I don't like that one, especially not as an overload.
I also don't like that it's going to throw by default. And so when you hit it, if you 1K at a time, and then the last thing wasn't a full K, your last read at least is going to throw.
Well, I think the scenario there, and again, it's now weird and we're being opinionated, is you knew that there was a 1K, you did something with it, you now know there's a 1K, etc. And now you know, I have from here until I'm done. So either call read, because you don't know when you're done, or call read at least with a span, which is weird. Yeah, I don't like that. We shouldn't mix on read at least, we shouldn't have one be int returning and one be void returning. That just feels wrong. And then
honestly, I really thought our guidance around arrays and strings versus spans was about whether they were usable from other languages, not whether we wanted developers to learn the concept of span and memory. I was supportive of it when I thought it was, we want to make sure the APIs are usable, and so we're going to provide overloads that enable them to be used from other languages. But I'm having trouble getting behind the idea that we don't want a developer to learn the concept of a span or a memory. And to my knowledge, you can use this in every language we're aware of.
I could deal with users not learning about memory, but span is something that I think everyone should learn.
Well, as soon as you throw async in, then you have to know about memory.
Yeah, but memory has other issues.
For that first overload, the read at least it takes a byte array, like would we actually want to call that read exactly? Because that would be the behavior, correct?
Yeah, I mean, I think exactly, which also got suggested from the chat. And by the way, YouTube, I don't hear any music, so it's either emo or you're playing two channels on your side. I think read exactly is what the byte one there does, and we could have read exactly that takes a span, and we can do read exactly async, and those are all fine. But that read at least is a different scenario, and maybe we leave array out of that one. That's a point where it's like this is hard to talk about with an array and an offset and a length, and so just slice it if you want the middle, or just implicitly convert it if you want the whole thing. Yeah, so going back to the should we have read at least and read all, I think read exactly solves the, we're not implying it's the whole stream, it's the whole buffer.
Mm-hmm.
So read exactly would be void returning, take both byte and span, or be overloads for byte and span.
Yep.
And it throws on the end of the stream. And there's no option.
It throws if it didn't fill it.
Right.
Because you said read exactly. And it did not do what it said on the 10, so it throws an exception.
And if you don't like that, then you drop to read at least.
What's weird is if you try catch the operation, it will have had the side effect of already filling your buffer. You just won't know with how much. But yeah, so I think we can have void read exactly, and then leave the int read at least as is.
Yeah, I didn't mean to argue in favor of the top overload. I'm not necessarily, married to it or opposed to it. It's just I don't think the name's appropriate.
Yeah, I don't like it as an overload of read at least.
But it would be 4, right? It would be 4 new methods, because it would be read at least or read exactly and read exactly async, and then it would be byte array and span or memory. Each 4.
Well, and then I think we would leave the read at least and read at least async.
Why not just have read at least mirror the span one, but take byte?
Because then we can't ever add the offset and length one.
Yeah, but at that point they can just slice.
Well, if they can, yeah.
It's just now we're just getting inconsistent. And then again, while we know that VB can do the slice, I have no idea what COBOL.NET does.
I mean, we could always take array segment. That is, in fact, byte array, offset, and length, and so we could just take that instead for this one API and say, in the scenario where you've got this weird extra int parameter, just take array segment to encapsulate the parameters together.
I think we largely think of array segment as a vestigial type at this point.
Yeah, but if it helps fill this specific case and avoid the issue and avoid needing to come up with yet another API pattern name, etc., then it seems like it's still a perfect use case for it. And you can still slice and do everything with that. You can convert it to a span, etc. And
this is 4 other languages? The reason for this would be 4 other languages, not because we don't want to teach people about span.
Right. 4 languages that, for whatever reason, can't convert an array to a span and then call slice on it. Array segment would fill that gap. It would also be more efficient because it'd keep the parameter count under, 4. So it's just generally better.
Well, but I think array segment's a struct, so it would
undo
its own efficiency.
Which is still better than passing the extra parameters and having them be a double indirection.
I'll take your word on it. I thought that basically struct fields spilled up into the signature as far as that was concerned. But
No, they get passed by shadow copy. So it's an implicit read-only by ref, basically.
Fair enough. I literally don't know what. I know that COBOL.NET, it's basically my example for a .NET runtime we don't pay attention to. I know they've done work to be on versions of Core. I have no idea whether they can even talk about a ref struct.
Well, this is the fundamental problem with span, right? It's this thing that the language support is anywhere between I can't use methods that exchange it at all to where VB is, right? Which is this somewhat weird in between thing where you can kind of use it as long as you don't have to declare locals, which is a super weird behavior. Which I also think is less desirable. It's just that that's the behavior the compiler has, and they got that more or less for free. But I don't think if you would spec a language, that's the way you would propose to implement it.
Could we say we don't expose any byte overload yet, and we wait for people to complain?
So when you say byte overload, you mean byte array one?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's kind of where this conversation started, I think.
So the only
I was proposing.
So the only problem that I have with that is that normally, or the bar that we're using is you're basically saying, either you use span or you don't, right? If you use span, then we expect you to be able to slice it, and then, which is kind of when we say you're a C# developer, the expectation is, you learn span, you use it, you declare locals, the compiler tells you when you mess stuff up, right? That's the general expectation, right? And then there's the other case, which is, your language either doesn't support span at all, or it has a very weird support for span. If that's the case with VB, for example, I would not expect VB developers to know that they can implicitly convert span from string or array, because you can't declare variables of it, so it's not a type you can actually normally use. So I wouldn't expect them to be able to know that. And then the question is just, okay, is this a perf-oriented API, meaning you can already do it, but just the span API is doing it in a better way? Then it's totally fine, and there are no array overloads at all, because you can already do it. It's not, it's not efficient, and it's fine. And that's where a lot of the crypto APIs were in before. It's like, there's one, but the new things we added were all span based. And yeah, for those we didn't bother with byte array overloads, because, well, they just do what you can already do. This case here is slightly different, right? Because it does the loop for you, right? That's the value that it adds. Which I think we convinced ourselves that this is what most people want anyways. And so the question is just, do we believe this strongly enough to actually make an API for that? I mean, one counter argument is that, well, most people don't use streams anyway, they just pass them around, right? So people that actually call read on a stream are already in the minority camp. So maybe that's okay.
To maybe put another perspective on it, we've had span for nearly 7 years now. It works, since like almost 2015. It's been almost 7 years. And it works down level on .NET Framework for users who want it. Other ecosystems and libraries are exposing span. Maybe we're at the point where we say that a language that for new APIs like this, unless it's like critical and people are desperately asking for it, that languages need to start supporting span, and we stop considering that the maybe 10 COBOL.NET users that could theoretically not use span, because at that point they're probably not using .NET Core 7.0 or .NET 7 anyways.
Again, COBOL.NET has been updating.
Sure,
I'm pretty sure they got to at least 5.
And if at some point we're going to need or want to say, if you're going to use this version of .NET, you need to support span, in my opinion, because when you look at other things, like we're adding generic math interfaces, static abstracts to the core primitive types. If the compiler doesn't understand those, the compiler can now not use .NET 7. C++ CLI had to take a change for us to ship this feature. And any other compilers out there that don't update to understand the new metadata there will likewise not be able to use .NET 7. So we're already at a point where we're touching core primitive types in the framework in ways where compilers have to update or they're going to get left behind. And span is much less breaking than some of those other things. So, maybe we're at the point where we need to just tell people update or, stay on the legacy stuff.
I mean, I can kind of see that argument too, because I'm looking at what we did with value task, for instance, how a lot of our async methods now return that, and it's not something that you can use like traditional tasky constructs like continue with over. Like we really do expect you to use language features like await to interact with them. It might not be a perfect analogy, but it is like I can definitely see the argument for in favor of what Tanner said.
I mean, so I put it in the chat. What we put in FDG was consider providing array accepting alternatives for methods that accept span or memory values, and then consider string if it's char based. And the with a mix of some, this is hard in some languages, and you're throwing maybe more concepts at someone than they know. Granted, when we wrote that, span was a little younger, but
let me try this a different way. Eric's investigation showed two concrete scenarios. One really is the read exactly, and one is the I want to read at least this amount, but I want to give you a larger buffer. I think it's fine having two different APIs for that. At that point, you've got a read exactly that takes a span, and a read at least that takes a span, and read at least async that takes a read exactly that takes a memory, and or read exactly async that takes a memory, and read at least async that takes a memory. At that point, the only thing we're talking about as part of this discussion is whether, in addition to those four methods, let's say, we also have a read exactly that takes a byte array in addition to one that takes a span, right? That's the only thing we're discussing at this point.
That sounds good to me. I will ask one question, and Steve, you're a very good person to think about this one. Stream read span and stream read async memory are written backwards because of the way we had to evolve them. So would we want array-based versions of these things that call the array-based versions instead of cascade to the span-based version, so we don't get an array to a span to a span to an array to, like, that is a secondary question in addition to what's the public-facing segment.
I mean, these not being virtual, or we have some more flexibility. I think we should have any new overloads we add here delegate to the same method, regardless of whether they take a byte or a span. So if we add read exactly that takes a byte array, and we add read exactly that takes a span, they should both call read span.
Okay. Yeah, so I think I'm happy with read exactly byte array, read exactly span, read at least span, read exactly async, and then asyncify those things. So I think I'm happy with 6.
How did you get to 6?
2 read exactlys and 1 read at least is 3, and then a times 2 for async is 6.
Got it. Sure. I don't think the byte one is required, but I'm happy to make, if we're already going to have the read exactly with spans, having an extra one that takes a buffer, I don't really care.
And then we could decide if we want, a 7th or 8th of buffer offset and length. I don't have strong feelings, but once it's read exactly, you now have we don't have this floating what's the order of the ends. And honestly, I think most people who call read always have wanted usually buffer 0, buffer.length, but worse, they want buffer offset length minus offset, and that the current read API has never been helpful to people.
That's where the span ones are really useful. Just do span.slice 4, and it takes care of the remainder for you.
Indeed.
Yeah, I wouldn't do the offset and count those array ones, because like if you're that detailed where you really want it into this part of the byte array, then just call slice.
Yeah, I think that it's less about that. It's just that I think we have to accept that if you're in C#, I think it's like all of this is moot in my opinion. If you're a C# developer, I would expect you to learn span. It's really about the languages where you either don't have span or the support is flaky. And I think that the only sensible thing we can say there is you may not be able to get those perf gains. You may have to call read yourself and do the loop yourself if you care that much.
Yeah, it's not even a perf gain. These are just convenience methods.
Sure.
Yeah, I guess at that point that's the way to.
We had discussed at one point in the past just kind of making like a friendly extensions package with like tons of overloads that you could ever possibly want across a bunch of different core types. If we did, for whatever reason, ever want to create and productize such a thing, like you could imagine the extra overloads going in that. As extension methods.
I mean, if we wanted to throw virtual out the door on this one, then all of this could be extension methods because it's really just convenience methods. I'm not saying we should, but we could.
We generally don't ship extension methods in the same assembly as the base type, though.
Right. Again, this would be if we felt that this was that we had a reason that we wanted to do usability extension package thing, like that they could go in there. I'm not advocating for it. This is not a generic type, so we don't have generic spill. So all of our guidelines on this say these should just be instance methods. The only reason we would put it in an extension method is if we thought we wanted to add it for net standard 2.0, and I don't think we would have enough justification to do that.
Makes sense to me.
So can you summarize where we are now with overload? So basically we would have a read exactly.
So yeah, rename the top one to read exactly.
Yep.
Spanify it, so copy it and make a span version. And now take these top 3 things and asyncify them. And then I'll let Steve say whether or not value task event is correct, but I believe our answer is read exactly, async should just be task.
No, I think this should be a value task.
Non-generic value task? Like again, I'm willing to believe value task end, but I thought that your answer was you're the only person in the world smart enough to use value task correctly. Everyone should just use task.
Well, but stream the reading writing methods are generally ones that are hot path. And we're implementing them. Eric is smart enough to make these values. I mean, we might even choose to use the built-in pooling functionality on these. I think I would be concerned about the long-term implications of having reading APIs new read APIs allocating on every call.
But the built-in but non-generic task, if it completes synchronously, it just returns completed task, and if it returns asynchronously, then it created a task anyway.
No, that's the thing. It doesn't necessarily create. It may not have created a task anyway.
Yeah, it could pool, like Steve said. For the byte array overload of read exactly async, Steve, do you imagine that returning a value task as well? I know that our other byte array overloads return regular task.
They do. That's legacy more than anything else.
Okay, I mean, and because this is a new API, we should use the better stuff.
And it should have a cancellation token emo.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I get angry with myself sometimes when I think of my own guidance around value task, and it largely stems from the fact that it didn't always exist. But you know, if we expect that all you're going to do is just await these things, and you're never going to do anything else, you're just going to wait them, then the return type doesn't really matter, and we might as well do the thing that in general allows us to potentially be more efficient, and that is value task. The difficulties with value task are if someone might want to do something other than await, because then there be dragons. And if you're dealing with APIs that already have task-based return values, then it's more likely that when you change, you know, the overload that you're using, now you forget that you can't do the same kind of things, that you can't just put them in a dictionary or await them multiple times or whatever. But for brand new APIs that are potentially hot path, where we could potentially do something more memory efficient, even for the asynchronous case, you know, certainly for the one that takes some memory, I think we should have the option of pooling objects under the covers. And then for the one that takes a byte array, which I don't think should exist, you know, from the beginning, but since we've said it's going to exist, I think the safest thing is for it to actually be consistent with the other overload and just have the same return type.
And your analyzer would also help catch misuse of this anyway, correct?
If you turn it on, it's a suggestion. So it's on by default, but as a suggestion. So it won't cause any build warnings, but you'll see it in VS. And that's mainly because they're false positives. What's that? What did you say, Levi?
I think that should be good enough for now. Like we can always revisit that decision if we tweak it further.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean putting it in a dictionary is if you had a dictionary of type task, it's going to make you start changing things, and that's like, yes, the easiest thing is you just change it to value task if you weren't intermixing things, and now you've got issues. But I can agree that the thing you're most likely to do with stream async is await, but things like HTTP client, which I think is value task, like I think it's actually really common to be like, go dispatch this thing, hold that task, maybe now do some more work, and now ask, has this task completed?
Right. It's the scenario of I want to compute something once and then reuse it many times. Like making that value task is dangerous, just because you're likely to use it in some lazy thing where you await it multiple times, and then that's a problem. Mm-hmm. But if the API is really just await, read exactly, you know, my buffer of 4, there's no danger to being a value.
Yeah, and honestly, most people are just going to await this anyway, I think. I think you're right, Jeremy, that like multiplexing is more common when you talk about maybe higher level APIs like HTTP client. I haven't ever really seen people multiplex directly on stream itself. That's not to say it hasn't happened, it's just I don't think it's that common.
Mm-hmm. My general guidance for us, I think, is, you know, and all the APIs that are focused on, I'm going to read and write, you know, read and write bytes, or read and write small things, and so I'm going to be very, very frequently doing it. I think our default for those, like the guidance naturally pushes towards value task for those. It's the large, you know, end-to-end operations that are, or that happen once for something, like I'm gonna, you know, create a new connection and I'm already allocating a bazillion bytes as part of creating a new connection. Task is good for that.
Okay, so the guidance that you had me put in the book of if you're non-generic, the correct answer is task and basically stop asking questions is still the right thing in the book because the BCL is really the only thing that should be playing at the lower level that you want to make the distinction.
I mean, I think for both of those, it was task is the right default, but there are reasons you should go to value task for both task and task of T, value task and value task of T. And even like that book was written after we'd already added stream dot write async that returned a value task. And it's because there are that is a hot path method where there is a reasonable chance someone is going to be able to do something more specialized. And this falls in the same boat. I don't think the book is wrong. I think that the default, given how we arrived where we are, with how much history of stuff we have behind us, this is unfortunately not something where it's just where we can just say let's just do the simple thing and tell everyone to always use task or always use value task. We unfortunately do have subtlety, and so I think the default is still the right one. The book's guidance of use task and task of T, unless, and this falls into the unless.
Yeah, I think I was actually remembering the very, very complicated thing I had first with waterfalling rules and what actually got written down. There are exceptions later, but is do use non-generic task, do use task of T, and then it talks about when you might want to do other things.
Right.
So.
And that basically amounts to things that are likely to be on a hot path where someone could potentially do something more efficient, and this falls in that category.
All right, so
one last thing about read exactly. Basically, the byte array one, you never want to call that with array pool, right? Almost never is it right to say array pool rent something and then call read exactly with the byte array.
Yeah, I have trouble thinking of a situation where that's warranted.
I mean, I can see somebody doing that though, because I think I've done that before where I'm like array pool rent 40.
Yeah, I mean, this is the issue Levi raised earlier, and I think it's a valid concern.
Yeah, I wanted to bring it one more time up. Are we okay with 14 and 8?
We can certainly duplicate them to also be the array offset and length, because if following Steve's feeling of what we should do with new methods on stream, basically it's just going to null, argument null exception the buffer, and then it's going to call as span, and so we can add the other overload.
Well, to be clear,
the fact that we've added the one that doesn't do it, you're still going to have that problem with array pool.
My personal opinion, this is an issue with lines 8, 9, 14, and 15. I don't think this is specific to the ones that take byte, because if we didn't have line 8 and line 14, someone can still call array pool.rent and pass it in. Their call site will look exactly the same because it will implicitly cast.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really an issue with read exactly, where you're not having to specify an additional amount of how much you would like to read, a minimum amount you would like to read, because there you would have to be saying buffer.length, and at that point it's on you. There's nothing we can do about that.
That's fair. Yeah, maybe there's an analyzer that someone could write that they want to be helpful here that if we see that an array came from array pool and you didn't look at the length, don't call read exactly, but I think many people have wanted it takes just a byte array and not the offset and length for read. I think some of network stream added it, in fact, as an overload for read, and so there's always been this issue. We could say that instead of void returning, they're returning and they return buffer.length, but
no, I don't think. Well, I don't think that helps.
Yeah.
I think
that would just raise questions of, can this return less than the length on the stream completed? And I think being void here actually is clearer. It reads this much, and if it can't, it throws. It's up to you to know how much this much you passed us.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a valuable. This is something people have wanted for years. It just is potentially misused if you don't really understand how big the buffer is.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that's just something, regardless of the byte array overload, that's just something this API requires us to accept. And like you said, if we are really motivated, maybe there's an analyzer or two in there.
But I mean, if the buffer came in from, I guess if the buffer came in from somewhere else, you would have either bounded it or been willing to accept it already. So it's really only if it came directly from like arraypool.rent. But all right,
yeah, okay, yeah. I was gonna say, I almost wonder if read exactly should take offset count for the buffer for the byte array rather. I don't know.
I mean, again, the problem is if you didn't just the array pool, if you don't pass the offset and the link, that it implicitly converts it, and if you got it from array pool, then you're probably, you won't get null, so you're not missing out on the null check. But the yeah.
I was actually thinking of it for other reasons. This issue aside, if you're using C#, you don't need the byte array overload to call it with just the byte buffer. So if you actually wanted one that you wanted to pass offset and count to, we could just add offset and count to that overload, and C# developers aren't losing anything. But
that's fine by me. I guess that's exactly the knowledge level there of if you know that byte arrays are implicitly convertible to spans, then you can call the zero arg one. Actually, the C# compiler will let you do it. But so yeah, maybe we just I'm fine adding offset and count here. We should call them whatever read calls them.
Eric, do you have an opinion?
We're putting the byte array overloads in there specifically for other languages, right?
I believe. Well, I don't know. I thought that's what the reason was.
It's part of the reason,
but it seems like it's more because we didn't. I don't know. I really don't understand the reason now.
What's the other part?
So again, when we wrote the guidance, we had the point where basically if you didn't report to John Cunningham, you don't know what a span is, right? That at the time that the guidance was written, that was basically true. And so it was, don't force someone to go learn what a span is just to call your method, especially if it's a type that we expect people would use in like CS1. So it's the more advanced and low level your type is, then the more you can depend only on span. The more friendly your type's supposed to be, you should be still talking in arrays. That was our rough starting point. Maybe the universe has evolved enough that we need to rethink that, but that's where we got, or that's how we got here.
Is stream friendly?
I mean, stream is the most unfriendly friendly type we have, but it is also the type that's like in core. CS1, you read from a file. That's file stream. So, ta-da.
Well, I think with stream it's a bit more nuanced, right? I think people pass them around a lot. Very few people call methods on stream. So I think people, in CO and CSS 101, you might heard about what a stream is, and or you compose them with other things like compression or something, right? But I think there's very few people that actually write code that says .read ever, right? I think that's most people call other APIs that do that. But I think to me, like I would say that guidance to me is a bit more nuanced, right? I think, as I said earlier, like I think I can get behind if you use C#, you should know what a span is. I mean, it's a core type. You may not use it a lot, but I think it's reasonable to say you can use it in the language, so you should play with it. But I think if you're in a language like VB where playing is severely hamstrung by the fact that the language doesn't quite support the type or supports it in a very weird way, I think it's a bit odd to expect people to know that the type exists and you can implicitly convert to it, but you can't quite use it. So it's kind of this weird thing in the middle of it. And then there's this long tail of languages that don't support it at all, right? So I think, to me, there's this, like, you know, if you're in C#, I can get behind the friendliness of other types. But I think there is a continuum where you can say at some point you may have to just call slice, right, on the array, right? That seems fine. But I think the problem is now when you compare this with other languages where I just can't do it because the types that are involved in this expression aren't supported by the language, then it basically means the API is not usable at all. And now the question is that acceptable? And I would say it is acceptable if the API that we're talking about is only provided for perf and you can do it via other means, right? But this API here is really not quite that, right? It's a bit more like oh, I really don't want to write the loop because it's error prone, right? So I would argue this API actually adds value, and it is a bit more, you know, making the API that is arguably fairly unfriendly a bit more friendly. But I can still get behind the argument that the amount of people that use Stream, like meaning calling APIs on it, is so limited that we can effectively say most APIs on Stream are expert level APIs. I think that's also a reasonable takeaway. But I can also live with the APIs we have right now and say that's good enough. If you need more, well then go learn C#. Or lobby your language to support spans, I guess.
Because yeah, the one thing with the, for VB where it's like, well, they can call things with span. It's if you basically end up wanting to pass that same span to like 3 different methods, we've forced you that you have to do the as span inline. You can't save it as a local and use it over and over again. So it is, VB's level of support is a weird, any task you can sign off on, but when they start writing complicated code, it's like, man, it would have been nice if they just took the byte array.
I guess. But yeah, I mean,
again, they could save the array segment and let the array segment go through the conversion.
So is that so? What we have on screen right now, is everybody okay with that, or is there more contention?
Steve had proposed adding, or just going ahead and making the byte array wouldn't be byte array offset and count.
This one here,
and line 8. Again, the purpose being, if you're on COBOL.NET and you have a byte array and you can't call the span one, then yes, you get to redundantly pass 0, buffer.length, but that's what you would have to do if you called read anyway.
I think that makes sense because, I mean, at least on Stream it would also be more self-consistent, right? Because read takes those arguments, and there's no downside to that, right? What do we call them? Index and count, I think, right?
Offset count.
Of course.
Is what stream.read calls them.
I had a 50-50 chance and I messed it up.
Well, it offset, index, or count, or length, and so.
And in some cases, we call them start, which I don't understand.
Oh yeah, that too.
Well, it's where you start to write.
Yeah, I just mean we somehow ended up using start like a decade after we'd already used the other terms. So, yeah.
I think nobody reviewed parameters back then. Yeah, all right, so then this is it?
Are you happy, Eric?
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, I think so.
I was about to type behold this masterpiece, but
All right, have we missed anything from chat?
Not that I see. We throw if the buffer length is less than count, to answer the YouTube question.
Yeah, because
I don't remember
returning, right?
I don't remember what the as span, what it named the parameters, but if they're named offset and count, we're just going to call as span after doing the null check because it won't. But yeah, your values need to make sense.
Yeah, there are well-defined argument exceptions for that.
Sorry, one stupid question. At first I put minimum byte length, and then I rewrote it to be minimum bytes because when we did the pipe reader stuff, we actually proposed minimum bytes. Is everybody okay with minimum bytes as the name?
I mean, given that the parameter is an array and there's no ambiguity between length and number of bytes, I think that makes sense.
And minimum length feels out of place. So basically, you're saying this is the minimum allowed for the return value, and the return value is in bytes. So it's slightly clunky, but I got nothing better. So ship it.
Read at least minimum bytes, right? So okay. Thanks, everybody.
All right.
And Tuesday's generic math, right?
I mean, unless you tell me on Monday that you can't, you're on the hook, yes.
Good.
Awesome.
It's all you, Tanner. Go for it.
Yeah, gonna have lots of stuff to catch up on. It's gonna be fun. Everyone's brains will melt by the end.
Oh no, I'll be high before the meeting starts. I'll make sure that I have the right amount of lubrication in my bed. All right. Enjoy, everybody.